Hello everyone, I'm Brophy1322 and this video will showcase the fastest cars in the GTA 5 Muscle Cars class, organised first of all by race tier and then by lap time within each tier, with the top speed of each vehicle also shown in order to identify any outliers. All 84 muscle cars have been put through their paces on my testing track and top speed run, and we'll be going from the slowest O tier cars to the top S tier in this video. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on future testing of new vehicles added to GTA 5 and beyond, and check out other classes in the playlist. This video is supported by my wonderful channel members here on YouTube. Click the join button below the video to directly support the channel and find out all the perks you can get by doing so, including early car testing info and having your name listed at the end of each video. As we see the vehicles in the muscle class that aren't usable in regular races, it's important for me to let you know that the intro video to this series, which is linked in the description and pinned comment, likely answers any questions you have about this testing, from simple things like what car upgrades are needed to maximise performance and what HSW stands for, to more complicated things like why I use off-road wheels and overall testing methodologies. Give that video a watch if there's anything that you don't understand here, since everything there is assumed knowledge for this video. So non-raceable vehicles first, and obviously mostly these are the arena vehicles from the class, with two distinct groups really, where 4th to 6th for lap time are inverted for top speed, and then 1st to 3rd are also inverted across the two metrics. None of it really matters since you'd only ever want to use the death bike in arena game modes anyway. But it's a shame that we can't race these cars elsewhere, because some of them would be quite fun. You know, I can imagine doing a sort of a death race, if you like, on a proper racing track would be quite interesting. But yeah, ultimately the quickest of the non-raceable muscle cars is the Arena Impaler. Slightly quicker, about half a second quicker than the Dominator, but like I said, 3rd in that sort of subclass for top speed. The Dominator has the higher top speed. Now, as we see some of the slowest vehicles in the class for lap time, it's worth noting that we were a little spoiled by the sports class, where we had 89 cars in the mid-pack separated by just 7.5 seconds to give some really close tiers. This time we've got 78 cars across the whole class separated by 22 seconds, so the class as a whole, and by extension the tiers within it, are a little wider from top to bottom than what we saw from the previous video with the sports class. That's also why we've got the same number of tiers as sports, going all the way down to O, despite having about 30 less cars in the class. There's also a lot of what you could say are repeats in the muscle class, the first of which we see with the Voodoo and Voodoo Custom, because a lot of Benny's upgraded lowriders found themselves in muscle. Sometimes the custom versions are faster, like we see here with the Voodoo and the Voodoo Custom. I would say the Voodoo is more of a spice pick for tier N, but sometimes they're faster, sometimes the custom versions are actually slower, so you're paying more money to upgrade them into a slower version, and sometimes they're basically exactly the same as their regular versions, but they are all listed here because they are all separate vehicles entirely. And we round out the N tier with the Virgo Classic, which has a slightly worse top speed but a better lap time than the Voodoo Custom, so a decent balance there. Tier M contains the quintessential muscle car of the Moonbeam. It still amazes me that this got into the muscle class. It's almost as bad as the Ballistic Compact being in sports. It's clearly a van, but you know, the Moonbeam Custom exists, so it probably just got thrown into muscle because it had a custom variant upgradable at Benny's. And we also have in this tier the Clique Wagon, which has the lowest top speed in the class, a full 3 miles per hour slower than the next worst, so again a decent balance there with the grippy, higher top speed Moonbeam. Tier L is quite interesting because it has 4 cars that are all separated by only half a second from top to bottom, and it contains some vehicles with quite varying handling characteristics. For example, we've got the Chino Custom here, which is actually slower than the regular Chino, just because running it lower to the ground with the lowrider version actually hurts it in the corners. Even though the Chino Custom has slightly better stats and it has a slightly higher top speed, it doesn't corner as well as the regular version with regular suspension handling characteristics. We've also got things like the very low grip Lost Slam Van, the quite understeery Hot Knife, and then the grippy but significantly worse top speed than what we've just seen of the Chino. So it's an interesting balance in the L tier, and certainly would provide some good races even this low down in the muscle class with pretty poor lap times. The next two tiers are kind of basically dual tiers because they've both got two vehicles that will be able to compete at the top, and both very similar in terms of the aspects to them, where we have in the K tier the Broadway, which has the better top speed of 100 miles per hour, versus the Virgo, which has the better lap time but a slightly lower top speed. Even though they're both very close, again, you'd probably get some good racing between the two of them, but we're not talking about crazy lap times and top speeds here. And the same sort of thing is true for tier J as well. We have the Eudora, which is a bit of a spice pick with this one, honestly, because there's no point in putting it on its own at this low down in the muscle class, and it would be too quick for, you know, the K tier, tier K that we've just seen. So better to put it in here, and you know, you can use it if you want to, if you're feeling a little bit daring. But ultimately the top two for the tier J are the Manana Custom, which again has that higher top speed but the worst lap time, in comparison to the Brigham, which has the slightly better lap time but the slightly worse top speed. So again, both tiers J and K have two cars with that good balance between the lap time and top speed differences. The Moonbeam Custom starts off the I tier by being an absolute grip monster. While it's a little off the pace normally, there will be some grip centric tracks where it really comes into its own. And it gets that spoiler on the back of it from the rear wheel modification, and that's what gives it the extra lap time over the regular Moonbeam, which it shares basically all the other stats with exactly the same. The rest of the cars in this tier are actually separated by less than half a second top to bottom if you take out the Moonbeam Custom. Again, with another variety of performances, such as the more consistent and decent to drive Picador and Virgo Classic Custom, the broken but not as bad as it used to be to drive Faction, and the super low top speed but good grip Faction Custom Donk. Of note, the Faction is the first car we've seen to have a top speed of over 110 miles per hour, and the Faction Custom Donk is the last car we'll see that has a top speed of below 100 miles per hour. Alright, tier H. This is actually the biggest tier in the class with 8 vehicles, but 2 of them are kinda spice picks. We're starting off with the Lurcher and then the Ellie. They can't really compete with the other vehicles in the tier, depending on the circumstance, but they are there if you want to have a little bit of a challenge if you're going to be running a tier H race. The other 6 vehicles in the tier are separated by just under 1 second, and we finally see a respectable top speed with the 118.5 mph Peyote Gasser, but naturally it's difficult to get it around the corners. But it does get that, that top speed does allow it to be 20th for the muscle class in what is a relatively slow class overall when it comes to muscle. There's a few very quick cars at the front, but most of the vehicles, they're pretty slow. The Faction Custom here is basically exactly the same stats as the regular Faction, but it has suspension that isn't completely broken. And then the Nightshade is ultimately, I would say, the opposite of what we saw with the Peyote Gasser, where it's got no top speed, but it's got incredible grip around the corners. And on the right track, the Nightshade can actually keep up with some tier G cars. That's how good it is in the corners. The top 3 in the tier of the Vigero and the 2 Buccaneers are some lovely cars to drive and to have some good overall performance, in most situations. So they're probably your best bets if you're going to do a tier H race, to cover all your bases and have a reasonably nice driving experience. But then there's all the other cars if you want to mix it up a little bit, and if you're on a grip heavy circuit, for example, go with the Nightshade. If you're on a very high top speed circuit, you go with the Peyote Gasser. Alright, time for tier G now, which begins a pattern of every tier from here on out having between 5 and 7 cars each, with most having 6, in a show of interesting options to race with everywhere. The 6 in this tier are all separated by just over half a second and contain some absolute classics like the Gauntlet, the Phoenix and the Stallion, alongside some newer vehicles like the Gauntlet Classic and Hustler, which the Hustler is the first car to break the 120 mph barrier for its top speed, and something that only 15 cars do in, like I said previously, in what is by and large a pretty slow class overall with the muscle class. But it's interesting that we've got all these tiers from here on out having between 5 and 7 cars, even the top S tier, in comparison to Sports and Super, where the closer you get to the top, you get smaller and smaller tiers to the point where you've got 1 or 2 cars dominating in the top class. So at least we've got some interesting balance there. The Deviant actually comes out as the top of the tier for G, but it's not the nicest to drive and it doesn't have all that much top speed, so I would say use it with caution, and generally it's not going to be the one you're going to want to pick for these races most of the time. Tier F has our first car that's out of position for lap time, with the Tulip M100 getting a bump up from the G tier due to its much higher top speed in comparison to the Deviant, which it's only a few hundredths of a second slower than for lap time, so better to bump it up into Tier F and have it be competitive here, rather than most of the time it would completely dominate Tier G. And the same is true for the Deviant, better to have it in Tier G with that low top speed than just be completely useless in Tier F. The Tulip M100 is followed up by some of the original race car muscle cars, I guess you could say, with the Burger Shot Stallion and the Redwood Gauntlet, which were introduced alongside the Piss Was a Dominator and are basically faster versions of the regular Stallion and the regular Gauntlet. Very nice cars to drive, but they're obviously older vehicles that are mixing it in with some very new vehicles like the Tulip M100 and the Tahoma Coupe. And what you'll notice with the cars here in this tier is that as the lap times are getting slightly faster, the top speeds are getting slightly slower. So that ultimately culminates in the Tampa, which has the best lap time for the tier, but a much worse top speed. So again, it's that balance of, do you go for something more grippy like a Tampa but sacrifice the top speed, or do you go for something in the middle like a Tahoma Coupe? And that's the beauty of these tiers. The 7 cars in Tier E are all started by the huge top speed of the Gauntlet Classic Custom, being the first car that we've seen to get into the top 10 on either metric. It's still only good enough for 37th for lap time though in the entire class, which demonstrates that top speed doesn't really matter that much for racing in most cases, as the Gauntlet Classic Custom really struggles for grip around the lap. This tier is actually filled with really challenging cars to drive all the way through. The Slam Van Custom and the Hermes just after it are absolutely no exceptions. Just difficult on the brakes, you know, they can be hard to get around the corners, hard to carry the speed really in some of the corners without having some struggles in terms of oversteer or understeer. It's only really when we get to the Beta Dukes, which is obviously right in the middle of the tier as well, where we see a car that's a bit more forgiving, and this would probably be my pick for the tier for most races, because the top 3 cars all have those weird values in the handling data for wheel toe angle, which causes them to be really unpredictable and veer off in random directions with every bump that they hit in the road. Any of the other 4 cars in Tier E are probably safer options than these 3. At least with the Tulip you get some sort of predictability. With the unpredictability, it will veer off either to the left or the right depending on if you hit a bump on the left or right hand side of the car. But with the Arbiter GT and certainly the Vamos, you're pretty much going to be a passenger some of the times, and the car will just randomly go in a random direction as you're driving around, and you'll be lucky to get a clean lap. So yeah, probably go for the first 4 for Tier E. Tier D, on the other hand, gives us 6 cars that are all absolutely lovely to drive, and actually all older cars dating back to between 2013 and 2015. The Duke of Death is slightly off the pace, but its specialty is more about the armour that you've got on it and the fact that it weighs a lot, so if you're in a race that you're expecting a lot of crashes, that's probably the one to take. And this tier kind of goes to show that the old ways were probably the best in terms of the way that they programmed all these cars, because it seems like the original cars from back in the day are still some of the best to race with. And I would probably say that Tier D is probably one of the best tiers to race with across the entire class. There's a varied collection of cars with better straight line performance versus lap time performance relative to others, like the better top speed of the Ruiner in comparison to the better grip of the Coquette Blackfin, as well as there's cars here with various specialties, like I said with the Duke of Death earlier, but also some like the Blade, which has really impressive acceleration, and the super high traction of the Dukes, which ultimately tops the tier, while at the same time both of those cars have deficiencies in top speed. So different tracks will suit different cars in this tier, and also just different drivers, whichever one you generally prefer to drive and make the most of, whether it's a high grip car like the Dukes or a high acceleration car like the Blade. You can find something that you'll like here, and you'll be able to have a great race depending on the track with all of them. Another high top speed car that's also out of place when only considering lap time is what kicks off Tier C with the Gauntlet Hellfire. The car that's probably most like what you consider a muscle car to be in the entire class. Its big power and low grip are very difficult to get a hold of and manage, but depending on the track, if the driver is skilled enough, the Gauntlet Hellfire certainly can compete with the other C tier cars, and it would be absolutely dominant if we left it in the D tier. The regular Dominator is kind of another example of a high top speed car that's difficult to make the most of, but to a lesser extent than the Gauntlet. And then we start to get the polar opposite vehicles with the relatively grippy Impaler LX and the basically a sports car Dominator GTX. And this was the first time we ever got a muscle car that was basically just a glorified sports car. Big grip, but really poor top speed. It's exactly the opposite of what you'd expect from the Gauntlet Hellfire, so very different ways that they build up their speed around the lap, and they would provide some really interesting races depending on the makeup of the track. The regular Impaler is just a bit ahead of the Dominator GTX and a more well-rounded experience, I'd say, while the Greenwood hits the top spot with a lap time and top speed that suggests it would dominate, but it only has 3 gears, and that makes it very inconsistent in terms of the lap time that it gets. So yeah, it's an interesting tier, this one, that will certainly be more determined based on the track than anything else. Now, the B tier is incredibly close, with only half a second separating all 6 cars, and I would say it joins tier D as one of the best to race with in the class. The Ruiner ZZ8 and the Sabre Turbo Custom are probably the best all-rounders and the easiest to manage, while the Pisswater Dominator that sits in between them has a really big top speed but is a challenge to master around the lap. The Pisswater Dominator for a long time was one of the very best to race with in the muscle class, but always really difficult to make the most of, and generally most people would have been quicker with other things, and that would probably be true now for the tier B. The Sabre Turbo Custom is going to be a much more safe bet. The Ruiner ZZ8 will also be a much more safe bet than what the Pisswater Dominator is, but it's still there, and for those who can master it and make the most of it, it'll give a really great performance. The Drift Yosemite, on the other hand, is pretty much the polar opposite of the Pisswater Dominator because it has no top speed, and the biggest discrepancy between lap time and top speed positions across the entire class, with a difference of 44 places, but its good grip means that it can compete, again depending on the track, as long as there's enough corners and as long as there's not too much in terms of top speed sections. The top 2 are a few tenths ahead for lap time, with the Clique first up, followed by the Dominator GTT topping the tier after jumping around all over the place with the various changes Rockstar have made to the tuners' advanced flags over the years. It's now a great car to drive and right on the pace for the B tier, and probably one of the best ones to use, I would say, and the default option for tier B. Now, even though I've talked very highly about tiers D and B, tier A shouldn't be overlooked because there's another wide range of car types here, and 7 of them no less. While the lap time of the Buffalo EVX is closer to that of tier B than tier A, the electric nature of the car means that its acceleration will allow it to compete depending on the track type, and it would just be dominant in tier B if it was left there. Now, the remaining 6 cars in this tier after the Buffalo EVX, starting with the Yosemite, which just misses out on the top 10 for lap time, are all separated by only 0.3 of a second. It's absolutely incredible how close this tier is as soon as you get past the Buffalo EVX. And again, like I said, that will come into its own depending on the track type with that big acceleration. We see our first House Special Works car with the Arbiter GT, but as I've mentioned before, it's a pretty horrible driving experience, and even with that big top speed, I wouldn't even risk driving it. I would just give it a miss. Just stay away from it. It's horrible. The Weevil Custom next up is obviously famous for finally taking the crown from the pariah of having the highest top speed of any normal non-HSW car in the entire game, but its handling leaves a lot to be desired. It's not that great in the corners, but again, it's good enough for tier A, so it's a very fast car. The next two cars are basically identical with the Vigero ZX and its convertible variant, but basically what we're seeing with tier A so far is what we've seen with the A tier from other classes, where a lot of the vehicles here are sort of the non-HSW upgraded variants of what will ultimately be the fastest cars when they're HSW upgraded. So if you're going to want to pick, one vehicle, it would be the HSW versions, because then when you've got HSW turned off, you'll still be in one of the quickest cars, and that would be the case with the Vigero ZX. Their good top speed though allows them to compete with ultimately the car that is number one for lap time for the A tier, and that's the Dominator ASP. Just like the GTT, it's back to its former glory after multiple tuners handling flag changes, but be wary that it is competing with a fairly mediocre top speed given what we've seen from other cars in this tier. Nevertheless, lovely car to drive and really competitive in tier A. And that brings us to the very top S tier, where we see the top 5 cars in the class overall, and we make a jump of 2 full seconds per lap over the best that the A tier could manage with the Dominator ASP. The Buffalo STX is a relatively easy car to drive, and it basically feels like a sports car with a decent top speed to back it up. It's also right on the pace at the top of the class overall for those who are on old gen, because some of the top vehicles are obviously HSW upgraded that we're going to see for this tier. It will be fighting for wins when HSW is turned off with the Dominator GT that's only 0.3 of a second quicker than it but has a slightly lower top speed. Again, a really nice car to drive, but it feels more like a sports car in terms of the fact that it's got some good grip, good top speed. A 1 minute 2, 1 minute 3 lap time would be quite high up in the sports car class. They don't feel like muscle cars, so to speak, but there's a good balance between those two. But as we've become accustomed to over the last few years, it's the HSW cars that once again top the class overall, as we see the HSW version of the Buffalo EVX first of all, with its massive acceleration and really big top speed. It's able to shave a few tenths of a second off what the previous two cars could do, which kind of shows how good those previous two cars are, I would say. Now, it's not the best when it comes to cornering grip, and neither are our top two cars, which is why the previous two are still in the same tier, but they are ultimately the fastest, and as I said earlier, pretty much identical, with the HSW Vigero ZX and the HSW Vigero ZX convertible. It doesn't matter which one of these you pick, they're both basically exactly the same, but if you can handle the huge power that they're putting out with the lack of grip that they have, they'll be the number one choice for muscle car racers when HSW is turned on. Like I said, if it's disabled or you're on a platform that doesn't have the HSW upgrades, the Dominator GT or the Buffalo STX will do you very well. And if you find that you're having trouble with the admittedly very challenging Vigero ZX, give the STX or the GT a go, since you might find that you're personally quicker in those. Just be aware that as soon as a driver comes along who's able to maximise the HSW Vigero ZX, nothing else in the class will be able to touch it. By the way, the top 3 cars are the only ones in the entire class where their lap time position is the same as their top speed position as well. But yeah, the top 2 vehicles, obviously they're exactly the same. Like I said, it doesn't matter which one you pick, and I'm pretty proud of the 2 laps that I got from them being so close, and you'll see them side by side here. But they are just so quick in terms of, the tops. They have the highest top speed of anything in the game, in the class. They've got the best lap time because of that. They've also, they're not the greatest around the corners. Like I said, even in the S tier, the STX and the GT will certainly be better in the corners than what the Vigero would be. But when you put it all together, as long as you can handle the Vigero ZX, it's unbeatable. And again, like I was, complaining during the video about various cars not feeling like muscle cars, and the Gauntlet Hellfire probably feeling the most like a muscle car that you'd expect. It's nice that the Vigero ZX is at the top of the class, because that also really feels like a muscle car as well. The huge top speed, the lack of grip, really challenging. It's basically a Pisswasser Dominator on steroids, equally as challenging but just quicker everywhere. So yeah, it's a really it's interesting, the muscle class, you know, to have what we've seen is tiers that no huge tiers like what we saw with sports, where there was 2 tiers that had 16 cars each. We've not had anything like that, but a consistent group of cars as we go through the field that are all culminating together with their lap times, you know, 5 to 7 cars in each tier. It's really nice to see that there's a lot of options in a lot of different tiers, and the muscle class is quite healthy in terms of what you can race with. And even at the very top, even if you've got HSW turned on and you're on the platforms that allow it, you can still compete with some of the more grippy vehicles, or some of those that you prefer, like the Dominator GT or the Buffalo STX, or if you like that big acceleration, you can go for the Buffalo EVX. It's nice that there's options at the top of the class, when, you know, what we've seen from Supers and Sport is that your options are very limited. Now, if you haven't seen the Supers and Sports videos so far, certainly check them out. They'll be linked in the playlist in the description, especially the Sports video with its over 100 cars. And I'll be continuing to go through all of the classes, with Sport Classics up next, with any new vehicles being released, part of those full class specific videos. And yeah, I want to try something new for this one. Leave a comment, you know, you can comment whatever you were going to comment anyway, but with your comment on the video, leave your favorite muscle car. What is your favorite muscle car from this video? What's the one that you like driving the most, the one that you like, the thing that looks the best? Whatever it is, leave a comment with your favorite muscle car. And for this video, that's basically everything. Please consider supporting on Patreon or become a YouTube member if you want to support this work, and also get some extra perks for doing so, such as early access to videos and other testing results. Also, remember to read the description for more info, comment with your thoughts, like the video if you enjoyed or found it helpful, and subscribe for more. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.